Hi, I'm Richard Bolstad, and I'm talking to you, I believe, at the Resilience Online Conference. I'm actually speaking from New Zealand, around the other side of the world to most of you probably. And what I do actually in my life is I travel quite a lot around the planet, teaching specifically what the conference is about, teaching resilience. So my background is I'm trained as a teacher. I'm trained as a registered nurse, both general and psychiatric. And I'm also, I'm a member of New Zealand Association of Psychotherapists. I'm trained as a psychotherapist. I'm an NLP trainer and a trainer of coaches. And I have university training in hypnotherapy. And I'm also a few other things as well. I am an archaeologist, so I'm trained at a university in Britain as an archaeologist, and so I have a lot of different kind of hobbies. My work with resilience really began in 1998, and that was my first experience working in Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what I was doing there, I was working mostly in Sarajevo itself, somewhat in Pale, which is the headquarters of the Republika Srpska, which at that time had just essentially come out of the war between the Serb Republic and the rest of Bosnia. So I taught mostly psychiatrists in the hospital at Sarajevo there, and they themselves, in fact, as well as many of their patients, around 90% of the population of the city, were sort of diagnosable with PTSD at that time. So they'd been through this horrific 3-year war. And I began with the idea of teaching them the NLP fast trauma recovery process, the movie theatre process, which I'm sure many of you know some version of. And I began to realize that what I needed to do was not just to teach them trauma recovery, but to teach them skills for maintaining a resilient experience through lots of challenging situations, because they were still in challenging situations. So once I started developing this model of teaching resilience, rather than just the small part of teaching trauma recovery, then I offered this as a 2-day training in a lot of other places. And so, for example, I taught in Pyatigorsk, which is in Russia. And this was in the early 21st century, soon after the terrorist attack on Beslan School. So this was a group of Chechen terrorists who came across the border and attacked a school, or took hostage a school, and in the gunfight with the Russian authorities, hundreds of these children were killed. So I set up a training in resilience skills, which was to be run for all the psychologists who were working in that area, especially focusing on resilience for young people. Now, then I realized, okay, this is something that I can offer people in a war situation or in a situation where there has been a terrorist attack. And so it can pretty much work in the worst kind of experiences that people are going to come across. And so I also started running it in places where there were earthquakes or tsunami, and that includes Japan, where I have family in Japan. I'm coming from New Zealand. New Zealand has experienced a couple of serious earthquakes itself. My home city of Christchurch was destroyed in a significant earthquake. I went to Samoa, to the Pacific Islands of Samoa, where there had been a tsunami that swept across the south coast of the islands of Samoa and killed a lot of people. And of course, I train in Europe as well, particularly in Poland. And over the last couple of years, a lot of my training in Poland has been with people who are working with refugees who are coming across from the war in Ukraine. So I teach as well in Egypt, and Egypt has had a number of pretty traumatic experiences happen over the last few years. So we actually have a training in Egypt there for coaches who are called resilience coaches. And so that's a whole coaching training that is kind of based around the metaphor of resilience. And as you're going to see, from my way of thinking, resilience is pretty much what we teach people and call it NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming, how to sort of take charge of your brain and get the results you want. That's pretty much what resilience turns out to mean when you look at the details of it. So online, I've had the opportunity as well to teach in Lebanon after the massive explosion at Beirut there a couple of years ago, and online to people in Palestine and Israel, online especially over the last year of this horrific invasion of Ukraine, teaching hundreds of psychotherapists across Ukraine, and also teaching people who are working with refugees in a number of European countries there. So one of the big advantages of what I'm doing is that I get to see resilience in a lot of different cross-cultural kind of settings. My focus on the trainings is to show people resilience as being normal, and normal because life normally doesn't just carry on going smoothly. It would be kind of boring if it did. And what actually happens in life is that there are kind of periods of continuity, of smooth traveling, and then there are periods which you'd call crises, where suddenly things get thrown up in the air and you don't know what's going to happen next. And so that's not abnormal. I mean, birth, which was kind of quite a good thing, it got you into the world here, and that actually I think was pretty much of a major crisis for all of us. So crises are kind of normal. Going to school the first time is a crisis, leaving school is a crisis, starting a job is a crisis, falling in love is a crisis, and discovering that a relationship doesn't work is a crisis. And as time goes on, there are likely for most people to be kind of health crises as well. And eventually life so far usually ends in death, and that is also another kind of crisis. So crises are normal, and people respond to them in different ways. And when we do research on that, and the research that I'm using when I train is about what is resilience is mostly just very standard research that is kind of summarized by the American Psychological Association, the APA, and that's not the psychiatrists, that's psychologists. And so their research, which is again cross-cultural research, shows that in most crises, for most people in most places in the world, the most common result is what we call resilience. People actually, they are kind of shocked by the crisis. For a while, they can't make good decisions, things like that, but they kind of bounce out of it. So I teach that idea of resilience being the ordinary response. And sometimes people for a while, of course, in a crisis they will be so disabled by the crisis that they can't function in the ordinary way, and they go into a sort of traumatic kind of response, but they bounce back. Most people, even who do that, after a couple of weeks, they start to recover. So that's the second most common result of a crisis, is recovery. Now, the rarest result of crisis, which in a major social crisis involves between 5 and 10% of people, is people who, instead of recovering, they actually get worse. So they don't just stay the same, they actually deteriorate over time. And we know that that's due to the way their brain is processing that crisis. So instead of being able to eventually make sense of it and recover and work out how to live in the new situation, things get worse. So I want to show you a little bit about the detail of that. And I do actually have online, I have the manual that I use in different places, and that's kind of, I make freely available. So for example, after my last time in Germany, I managed to get a German copy of that manual, and that is thanks to Gudrun Heinrich Meyer, and she actually translated the entire manual into German. I have that in many different languages. Now I also have, in a couple of languages, I also have a book about it. So this is the English version of the book, How to Give Yourself a Hand Back Up. And this is the Polish version of the book, Resilience. And so this book we also have available in Russian, of course, because that's the kind of predominant language that that everyone in Ukraine can understand. And so this book is available in Russian as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly summarize the things that I teach in the weekend, and I train people to teach when they teach this course, Resilience, as resilience coaches and trainers. And I'm really happy for people to use these models in whatever way they can. You know, of course, like my passion for resilience is to create a world that is kind of better for all of us, safer for all of us. I have family. I have a grandson who is both Japanese and New Zealander, and I want him to live in a world that's safe and enjoyable to live in. So that's for me the kind of bottom line of doing this is I want to create a world that I feel good about, and that the people that I meet all around the world feel good about. And one of the things that I have learned in this whole process of going around the world and teaching people then is that what we're doing right now with me talking to you and connecting with you and talking to you about how people usually manage these kind of situations pretty well, even though they're crises, this is really, really important, because in the research about resilience, the number one factor that stands out more than anything else is that people are more resilient when they have other people that they contact. So having friends, having family who you like, those kind of things make more difference than anything else that I could tell you. And that's really important when I go into a community where there's been some major event, because, you know, if I imply that what I'm going to show them to do in their head is more important than their friends, I'm doing harm. So I need to explain to people, look, the most important thing is the people that you have as friends, the people you have in your family. And even when they say weird stuff, even when what they say contradicts what I might have said, it's more important to have those relationships. We know that from the research. So I don't control that entirely, of course. I can't teach people on the weekend how to build those long-term relationships. I do teach that in another course as well. But that's the most important factor. Now, another important factor that's not in my control is that people who have had bad experiences before are not so safe when it comes to a new bad experience. And that this contradicts an idea that I think a lot of people have, the idea that, like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, to quote Nietzsche. So it turns out he's mostly on the wrong track with that idea. And mostly, actually, what doesn't kill people actually scares the hell out of their brain. And if they have bad experiences like that again in future, then they won't respond very well. Their brain will get the idea, okay, the world is really dangerous. I was wrong to kind of calm down from that last event. And so when I go into a place like Samoa, for example, one of the things that the local people in Samoa said to me very clearly is they said, look, the people who are really distressed by this event are people not necessarily who've experienced a tsunami before, but who've experienced domestic violence in their home, who've had other traumatic experiences in their life. And those are the people who are kind of collapsing when this new experience happens. So that's kind of important. And one of the things that's important about it is that when I'm teaching people, I'm aware that I'm teaching them the trauma recovery skills, not just for the current crisis, but for all sorts of other things that happen. Let me give you an example. The first training then that I did like this was in Sarajevo. And so I'm going to demonstrate the trauma recovery process, the NLP trauma recovery process. So I say, okay, has a traumatic experience they'd like to deal with. And I thought, well, someone's going to come up with some bad experience from the war. They've seen a lot of people die in very unpleasant ways. And this guy puts up his hand and he says, well, can it be something from before the war? So I say, yeah, sure. So it turned out that what happened was when he was 18 years old, he went on his first date with a young woman, and they met together in the old town of Sarajevo, which is one of these beautiful old medieval sort of towns in Europe. And his girlfriend said to him, she said, I've got something to show you. And she reached into her shirt, into her blouse, and she took out a little pet mouse. Now, he did not expect her to bring a mouse out of there, and he was immediately shocked. And when he got shocked, of course, what happened was he thought, wow, now I've made it look like I'm frightened of her pet mouse. And that was the thing that really upset him. And he kind of freaked out at the thought, I'm humiliated. I've disgraced myself. And he ran, and he never spoke to her again. And so sad, because nothing had happened wrong, you understand. The only thing was that he was embarrassed. He was humiliated. But you see, that's what trauma is about. It's about the feeling in the person's brain that they are somehow, their identity is under threat. And for him, his sense of being a decent human being who was kind of strong and courageous and stuff like that was damaged by this little experience. And he developed a phobia of mice. Thank goodness he developed a phobia of mice, right? He could have developed just as easily a phobia of women's blouses, shirts, and that would have been a lot more of a problem because you see a lot more of them than you see of mice. But he developed a phobia of mice, and when the war came, he couldn't go down into the bomb shelters when the alarm sounded. He couldn't go down into the bomb shelters because he was afraid of mice. And so he would actually stand up there shaking in the street, knowing he could die and be horribly blown to pieces. And he was frightened of a mouse. And the mouse that he met, when he was 18, it didn't hurt him at all. It did nothing at all. So what happened in that time, when you have any new experience, the experience is coded in the center of the brain. And so it's coded in this area, especially the hippocampus here. And the hippocampus stores a temporary record of where you are, what the time is, and what was happening, what you saw and heard and physically felt. And next to the hippocampus is this area called the amygdala. And the amygdala is kind of like an assessment center. It works out how important is this, how serious is it. So some things that you experience, even though they're new, they're just not interesting, and some things you do a lot, like you brush your teeth each day, but you don't remember what it was like brushing your teeth last Wednesday, because who cares, So the amygdala works out, is this important? And it has two sides, actually. The amygdala is on both sides of the brain, and on one side it's working out, is this important in a dangerous way? Like, is this frightening? Does it get me angry? Does it hurt? Is it humiliating? Things like that. And the other side of the amygdala is working out, is this important in terms of, is there fantastic food here that I really want more of? Is there something very sexy here? So the amygdala is trying to work out how to keep you alive and get you to have babies. It's got no morals. It just wants you to stay alive and have babies, because that's how you get to have people with that kind of amygdala, and the people whose amygdala wasn't interested in that, they died out. So the amygdala is working out what's important about this. And one of the things, by the way, positive things that it does pay attention to is this unusual? Is this really interesting stuff? Like, if it's new and unusual, that's worth remembering as well, because a lot of cool stuff happens because we discover something that doesn't fit the pattern. That kind of makes us curious. So mostly those sort of things. So the amygdala is looking for, and especially those dangerous things, of course, to keep you out of danger. And so the amygdala, if it decides, yeah, this is really dangerous, it sets up an alert. And that's what happens in a crisis. And so that alert is meant to be strong enough so that when you think about it in the outer brain, the cortex, your cortex cannot override the amygdala. The amygdala doesn't want to be overridden. It wants to keep you alive. And so if it decides that this is dangerous, it's going to make you run away, like that 18-year-old Sarajevo guy who ran away, even though rationally he must have known as he was running away, there's nothing dangerous here. It's just a mouse. It's all cool. So he ran away because his amygdala is saying, no, there really is something dangerous. You could die. I can feel it. So that overrides his rational thinking about it. Now, the cool thing is there is a review system. So in the brain, what's going to happen is as you sleep at night, especially, or as you're doing some kind of meditation or just calm and not taking in any new information, your brain gets to reprocess these temporary memories, and it moves them out into the cortex, and it connects them to all other related memories, all other similar memories, and anything that looks the same or sounds the same and stuff like that. So that kind of connection in NLP we call anchoring. And what it means is that if you experience something that is in some way similar to the original experience, then it will trigger that memory of that, so you can get information about how did I survive this last time. And so, so when it connects it to all these other experiences, though, of course, it can calm down, because it doesn't just have the emergency, let's flee, run away, or fight. It actually now, as it calms down, it can think, hang on, I've had times when I've managed this situation or this kind of situation in other ways, and so I've got other ideas about what I could be doing here. So that actually happens as you sleep. The cortex makes connections to other things, and it can then reduce the emergency alarm on that particular memory. And that process of reorganizing the memory out there is called reconsolidation. Now, if the memory was really freaky, if something really scary was happening, let me kind of zoom in on that and show you that there is a place in the cortex, in the center, but just in this position here in the cortex, called the precuneus. And we know from a couple of years ago in 2019 that if a memory is really disturbing, when it's reconsolidated to the cortex, it's moved to the precuneus, and the memory is reorganized, so you're seeing it from outside. So you're actually seeing yourself in the experience instead of being caught up in it and feeling what it's like. So that's not some kind of NLP trick that we invented with a movie theater technique where you watch a movie of traumatic events. That is something that your brain has been doing since you were about 5, 6, 7 years old. It's been able to shift a memory out into the precuneus and adjust it so that when you think about a traumatic memory, it doesn't feel horrible anymore. It actually just enables you to learn from that experience. So all of that is kind of the normal process. Now, obviously, for that to work, you got to sleep. Right? And so if a process is really traumatic and your life is in danger, like what's happening for people in Ukraine, where there are 24 hours a day, there are bombs falling in some places, then the people are not going to sleep very well, and they're not going to reprocess their memories, and their amygdala is going to end up on pretty much permanent alert. So, so that's one of the reasons why people might not immediately be resilient in that kind of situation. Okay, most people are going to be resilient even then, though. So what on earth are they doing? Well, firstly, they hug their friends. They talk to their friends. That's a big deal. Secondly, they remind themselves of good things. And in order to do that, in order to remember, okay, I've had good experiences in my life, they actually have to believe that there's a bigger picture in which there's going to be just like there was a before this event, there's going to be an after this event. So they actually have to have a big picture of life and think, something else could happen in the future. And I had a really interesting experience just a few days ago. I was teaching a group in Ukraine, and it included some people who were in Russia. And that means that they are people who are sympathetic to the Ukrainian people. They are secretly online from Russia, and it's pretty hellish for them as well right now. Maybe they have family and friends in Ukraine. And I told them a really simple story. I told them about my son and my grandson. So my son is married to a Japanese woman, and my mother lived in New Zealand here at the time of the Second World War. And one of the things that happened then in the 1940s is that Japanese submarines were traveling around New Zealand, and they would sink boats that were coming into New Zealand. So they actually they sunk boats, they killed people, and they were preparing, of course, for invasion of New Zealand. And so my mother grew up as a child at that time. She was really, really frightened of Japanese people, and she would have panic attacks. So if I was with her at the airport and some Japanese people got off a plane, she would clutch me and she'd be saying, "What's happening? What's happening?" And she would go into a panic state. So she was traumatized by that childhood experience of the war, of course. And Japanese people look different to most New Zealanders. The original people of New Zealand are Pacific people, and then there's people like me who look suspiciously Nordic, which is where my family come from. And so so she could recognize, okay, these people, they sound and look Japanese, and she would start to panic. My son married a Japanese woman, and my mother's great grandson was therefore Japanese. And that was another kind of crisis for her. And so what actually happened was that she, of course, she adored my little grandson, and that's a really important thing to know, how that changed for her. I didn't have to do any NLP process about it. He was her great grandson, and she adored him. And in order to understand how that happened, you'd have to look 70 years out from the end of that war. And that's what I was telling these people. And I know from the feedback that I got from those people who were online from Russia and Ukraine, that was a really important thing to hear. I know it doesn't sound like a very promising thing to say, hey, in 70 years' time, this is going to look different. But that is how resilient people think. They actually know life is a big story, and this is a small part. So the other thing about this is that at the time of a crisis, people who are going to be successful, they don't just think of positive things, they plan, but they plan really small, really simple stuff. Like, I remember when the earthquake happened in Christchurch, and my mother was actually living in Christchurch at that time, the same mother who had the panic attacks about Japanese people earlier. And so I'm living in another city, and as soon as I could, I flew down. The planes couldn't land right when the earthquake was there. The streets were smashed and hundreds of people had died. And so I managed to get into the city 2 days later, and it was very hard to drive around. Only some streets were working. Other streets there were cars stuck into the street. It was very dramatic looking. And so I got to my mother's place, and I was expecting chaos, because when the big earthquake happens, it shakes everything so fast that all of the cupboards, they fling their doors open, and any plates and cups and things like that will just be smashed. They'll be thrown across the room. It's very dangerous, and it makes an incredible mess. And I also knew that there's no electricity in the city, so my mother couldn't just turn on a vacuum cleaner and vacuum it up. The electricity would run out, and so I expected that the house where she was living would be in chaos. And when I got there, it wasn't. It looked almost the way it would usually look, and everything was very tidy. And I was really, really shocked. And I sort of asked my mother, how on earth did you manage this? And she said, well, I knew that you would be here within a couple of days, and I just thought I have to tidy up the house for Richard. So, when I thought of that, I thought, man, that's crazy. I don't care. I'm just glad you're alive. That's what matters. But you see, for her, that was a very resilient thing to do, because it gave her a specific goal. Otherwise, she's just going to sit there thinking, I'm going to die. And this gives her something to focus on. Is, okay, I just tidy this room, and then I tidy this room, and with a broom, and And so it gave her a focus. And that's what resilient people do. They focus on not grandiose goals like what will be my achievement in 10 years' time, but like what can I do today, like getting a meal, for example, which was very tricky when like setting up some way of having a toilet in the backyard that you can dig into the earth because nothing is working, everything's smashed. So that's what I mean by goals, really simple stuff. Now, the other thing is that people who are resilient, they definitely, they look for learnings and they find useful meanings. So in NLP, we'd call that reframing. So let me give you an example. One thing I tell the people in Ukraine, they're hearing sirens continuously every day. And sometimes when they hear the siren, they think, okay, I'm going to die, there's a siren. And what I tell them, I know it sounds naive or simplistic, it totally works to explain to them, every time you hear a siren, that means someone loves you, someone cares about you, and they are sounding this alarm so that you can get somewhere safe. And that's what it means. And relaxing, learning how to relax, being able to relax even in that kind of crisis situation doesn't mean letting down your guard. That's another thing that people are afraid of in the crisis, is they're thinking, if I relax, maybe I won't be alert enough and I'll get killed. And what's important to understand is, no, it's actually when you're calm that you're going to make better decisions about where to go, what can you do next, stuff like that. So you owe it to yourself so you can look after other people to learn how to relax. So those are very powerful reframes. Those kind of reframes are, I think, pretty important for people to have. So that's what people who are resilient do. And on the other hand, people who get worse and worse, there's a pattern to what they do as well. Now, part of that pattern I don't control because it has to do with previous events, as I said, but there's also the fact that their thinking, for the people who have chronicity or chronic problems, chronicity is the term from the researchers, not from NLP researchers, just psychology researchers, they think differently to the people who are more resilient. So, for example, and by the way, this particular list of things that are related to chronicity comes from Andy Austin, who is an NLP trainer in Britain. And what he's saying actually fits with the APA stuff, so I'm going to tell you it using his kind of structure in a way. And one of the things that people who have chronic problems, long-term problems that get worse, do is they keep asking, why? Why did this happen to me? And why didn't I respond better? Now, look, in a terrible crisis, there's just no good answer to that. And you see that this feeling like of I should have been able to do better. This is what crisis is about. It's the feeling like I can't control what's happening. And that's what's a crisis. That's what's horrible about a crisis. It's not just physical pain. It's not just seeing people die. Those things are awful. But the feeling like I can't do anything about it in the way that I usually do it, that's even more scary because it's a feeling like it's going to happen and it's completely outside my control. So let me give you an example. When I was actually in Samoa, I worked with a guy there, and he was a father. And when the tsunami was coming towards, he was right near the beach, and behind the beach there was almost a sheer cliff. Now, I have no idea. I looked at that cliff and I just couldn't imagine how he got up there, I tell you. But he did, and he took a child under each arm, and somehow he managed to keep his balance and climb up almost a straight cliff and save the lives of these two children. And I saw him 6 months later, and he spent all day haunted by that, thinking to himself, why? Because he had 4 children. And he could only save 2. And he had spent the next 6 months asking, why did I kill those 2? Did I hate them? Well, Why? Why couldn't I have saved them all? I saved 2. There's no good answer to that, you know. Shit happens. And so you can see that the people who have resilience, they focus on like, what can I do? And he's entirely focused on, why didn't I do something better? And there's no answer to it. There's just no answer. It's just an awful thing. And he did whatever he could. The other thing that people who have chronicity do is they ask, what if? What if it happens again and it's even worse and I die horribly in pain? So they start imagining that, and they're trying to work out, how could I respond to this? How could I be in control? And the answer is, you bloody couldn't. And so that's not a question that leads to a good place either. What if really bad things happen? When I'm doing a process with them to resolve it, they'll start asking it again. They'll start thinking, yeah, but what if this process doesn't work? What if I'm stuck like this with anxiety and panic attacks for the rest of my life? What if? And of course, these why and what if questions in a small context, they work fine. Like, why did I fail the test at school? Okay, well, I didn't study, so next time I'll study. What if I fail the test next time? I'll pretend it doesn't matter. You know, like, it's only a test. It's just no big deal. But in a big thing, like an earthquake, a tsunami, a war, there's no good answers to these questions. And they make the person feel worse and worse, disempowered more and more, as they think about them hundreds of times and don't get a good answer. So what happens is they become obsessed with the bad things, and then they start to give them a name. You know, like, I have trauma. After I explain this to them, they tell me, oh, that totally makes sense. I have chronicity. No. There's no thing called chronicity. I just made that stuff up. You know, it's just a name that researchers use. And actually all it is a series of ways of thinking. And if you don't think those ways, then it doesn't get that horrible result. And it's very hard to believe at the time. It's really hard for the person to believe when they have such horrible experiences happening. So, they focus on the problems, they label them, they name them, and that means that they feel like they can't control them. Even when I guide them through a process, they start to feel worse, because as we're doing the process, they're asking, yeah, but why did it happen to me and not to my neighbors? Why didn't I respond better like you're showing me how to earlier on? What if it happens again? Can I actually manage this? What if this doesn't work, what you're doing? And so then, even as I guide them through a process, which could be a way of recoding it in their brain and showing them how to feel more resilient again, they start to believe that I'm making them feel bad. So they'll tell me that, you made me feel bad. You know, your process doesn't work. It actually made me feel worse. I started to freak out when I thought about it. So this is almost like putting a lock on the door. So now even if they try and get out, they start to feel bad. And so then they run from that again. So they get caught in this experience of chronicity. So the answer to that is what we said before: friends, goals, big picture, focus on positives, and have some cool reframes, some learnings that you can take out of this. Yeah. So that's about the 2 different kind of responses. And of course, when I'm teaching people, I'm teaching them over this weekend how to deal with all 3 sections of a crisis. So there's the crisis when it happens, and when a person has a traumatic response, that's all they remember. So they will, when you ask them what happened, they'll only tell you about this, how it was getting worse and it was awful and they couldn't stop it and horrible things were happening. And of course, what they're doing is, we would say in NLP, anchoring themselves really effectively. They're anchoring themselves to the point where the unpleasant emotion was rising and rising and rising. And they're not noticing that then they survived. And sure, scary things happened after, like with earthquakes, aftershocks, but actually they survived. So I want to show people how to manage in this crisis situation, because crucially, if you're with someone who's in a crisis, what they think at that time makes a huge difference. Then how to deal with the situation where it's still not out of danger, but it is kind of calming down. And then how to deal with the long-term situation afterwards when everyone else is on with their life and the person with chronicity still has trauma. So for this area here at the end, section C of the crisis, of course, we have several trauma recovery processes in NLP. And some of those, what Steve Andreas called the NLP eye movement integration process, which is having people look from side to side like EMDR, and look from corner to corner. We actually have some amazing research about doing those processes with people. Not just that it actually calms down their amygdala, reduces the size of the amygdala, things like that. Not just that it changes their brainwaves so that the extreme fast brainwaves stop and they get much more slow brainwave patterns. Not just that they report feeling better, but actually that when we check their genes, their genetics, that the epigenetic information is different in specified ways. So we can actually now, and again, that was just a couple of years ago, that research that when people do an eye movement integration process, that when it's successful, if we check their genetics afterwards, that the epigenetic information is different. So it tells their body, you don't need to produce all these chemicals of panic anymore. And so it kind of actually puts a lock on some of those processes, panic processes. And that epigenetic information, of course, is transmitted to their children and their children's children. So, so if they have children after that. So that's pretty important because, you know, I said, I'm in this business so we create a better world. And really how that's going to happen, is especially if we can help people to recover from the crises that they face now so that their children are born with a clean slate, with a fresh beginning. Yeah. So that's at that place there. Now, at this place here, I'm going to teach them the opposite of chronicity. So at the place where the crisis is still happening, but it's calming down, I teach them stuff like how to find better questions than why and what if, which, as I say, it doesn't matter what answer they find, they're crappy questions and the answers don't feel good. So, so people who are in situations and who are responding more resiliently, they almost have at the back of their mind a better question, like the question, what can I do here, or how can I best respond to this right now? So they have better questions that they're asking, and they don't ask, will I survive? That's a yes-no question that creates anxiety. They actually ask, like, what can I do? How can I do this best to get the results that I really want? So, so teaching them how to have a better question at the back of their brain, how to relax, how to reframe in those ways that I said, and that's what I'm doing here. Now, when I'm working with NLP practitioners and coaches, I'm always really interested to find they're often scared of crisis. So that's kind of interesting, right? So they're happy to work with people years later, but they're scared about going into the crisis. Now, I trained as a nurse, so I know a bit about emergency management as well. And the model that I teach people for the actual crisis, my aim is so that if someone does get into a crisis situation where someone's having a panic attack about something real that's happening, they have an idea how to respond. And the model I use, it actually originally comes from this model. It's called The Worst Is Over. And The Worst Is Over is by these two women in the United States. And this model is taught to people who are on ambulances, so crisis workers who are going into places. Sometimes I'm teaching firemen, by the way, people who go into small time crises sometimes, but big things for the people that they're dealing with. And so the person is injured in some way, they're shocked someone has just been killed, something like that. And so I'm really wanting to help them to deal with that immediate situation. Okay, now, let me see if I can find where that is. So I teach them 4 steps. It's got to be simple. So the first thing is obviously, if you go into a crisis, if you see someone they've just been told they've lost their job, for example, they've been fired, or they've just been told that they have some medical condition that could kill them, or there's just been a bomb land on their house, or I'm in New Zealand right now, there's been flooding here over the last few days in the city I live in. So there are people whose house has collapsed in floodwaters. And so in that kind of crisis, the first thing is just practically is first aid. Like you got to do stuff to help people, and you've got to usually phone emergency services. So that's first, obviously. Now, the next thing that people often don't know about is you've got to have what NLP calls rapport to be able to help. So you need to actually explain, hey, my name is this, and I'm going to help you with this. Is that okay? You kind of ask their permission. The reason why you ask their permission is not just to be polite. It's because you're telling them you are making choices here. You remember what's traumatic is the feeling like I can't do anything. So if you take over and you do everything for them, and you don't give them any choices, and you don't give them a sense they're doing something with you, then you're making it worse. So a lot of what I'm teaching people is don't make it worse for people by disempowering their natural ability to get support from friends, or disempowering their sense of being in charge in the immediate moment. So in that immediate moment, can I help you with this? And then acknowledge, and that looks really scary, that must have been awful, that's really painful. There's a very famous story of Milton Erickson, the famous psychiatrist, doing this with his little son, Robert, and Robert was 3 years old, and he'd just fallen over and fallen on his face on the concrete, and he's crying, and there's blood on the concrete. And the first thing Milton Erickson says to him is, he says, Robert, that really hurts. It's a complete opposite to what parents would usually want to do to reassure their child. Robert, that really hurts. And Robert's, yes, it does. And Milton, his father, said, and it's going to carry on hurting. And Robert's saying, yes, because that's what he's afraid of. That's what people are afraid of at this time. I can't stop it. It's going to carry on. And then Milton says, and we don't know if it will carry on for 1 minute or 2 minutes. And Robert said, no, we don't. And now he's agreed within 1 or 2 minutes it will stop. But Milton has not denied anything. He has just been saying, this is how bad it is. And then he says, and Robert, look at all that blood, which is what Robert's doing. And Robert says, yes. And Milton says, and is it good, strong red blood? Now this is shifting his attention away to something else, because Robert thinks it should be good, strong red blood. So he doesn't know. So he looks up, and Milton, his father, says to him, well, there's only one way we can find out, Robert. If we take you inside, get a bowl of water, and get a face cloth and wipe across where it's bleeding here, and we take that face cloth and we squeeze it into the water, if it's good, strong red blood, it will make the water pink. And Robert is immediately interested. He wants to find out. Now, what that's doing is distracting the person's attention and asking them to do something. That's really interesting. So what these two women, Judith Acosta and Judith Prager, teach is that at this point, having got their attention by saying that looks really bad, that must be really scary, is to shift their attention. They found if you want to reassure someone, the most powerful thing you can say at that moment is actually, the worst thing has just happened. Now we're going to do what we need to do to make it better. But you just, and that's usually believable. It's a weird thing. But if you told someone it doesn't hurt, it's all right, everything's okay, they know that's not true. But if you tell them, look, the worst things happen, now it's going to get better, that kind of works. So the worst is over. Can you help me by, can you help me by holding my phone while I just get this pen out and write your name down on paper, something like that, anything. Can you hold the pen while I check? So you're asking them to do something with you. And then you start shifting their attention like Milton did by saying, there's a lot of blood. Do you think it's good, strong blood? So what I do is if the person has a broken bone, for example, I say, now this obviously is really hurt here. How does it feel up here? How does this arm feel? How does this leg feel? And in this situation, the person will follow my instructions because they're shocked. They haven't enough brain space ready to think, hang on, what is he trying to do by distracting my attention to this place and that place? So how is this, how is this, how is this? That's kind of what Milton did. And is it good, strong red blood? Now, at this point, you can make direct suggestions. So you know that if you've trained in NLP, you say, as this thing is happening, so this thing is happening. So as you know that your body is aware of what this injury is doing, then you know already that your body is starting to heal. So what you're doing is telling the person this thing is true and you know it, and therefore this thing will be true as well. Your body will already be beginning to heal. It'll already be moving the blood away from that place so that it can seal up that area of your body and help it heal. So those kind of essentially hypnotic suggestions, they actually work in that situation. So this 4-step structure I get people to rehearse, to practice with in the room, so they are able to go into crisis situations. Otherwise, you can't get coaches and NLP practitioners to go into the damn crisis because they're afraid, but what if it happens again? What if there's an earthquake when I'm there? I don't know what to say to people who've been injured. And so I train them to be like emergency workers, like first aid workers. Okay, so I've given you a kind of, I haven't taught you the NLP processes, and I've given you a kind of overview though of what I teach on that weekend. And I've made it sound a little factual though, because some of it's pretty inspiring. And look, this is really important for you to understand as well, is that when people are resilient, they don't just feel okay about crises. They actually understand that things can change profoundly in a way that's also positive. And there's a story I often tell from Sarajevo, from that first experience I had. So I saw so many horrible things in that city, and I saw some amazing things. And one time there was a woman there, you know, and a bomb landed on the road beside her, and it didn't explode. So shells were being fired into the city by Serb militias from around the outside of the city. And it landed near her and didn't explode. And so she called the bomb disposal people, the people who deal with those, and they found out something interesting. Inside a bomb, there is an explosive, and there is a thing called a firing pin. And when the bomb hits, the firing pin pierces into the explosive and causes the explosion. And someone had broken the firing pin in this bomb. And they'd done that by bending it backwards and forwards. They could see until it broke. So at that point, they told her about that. They told her what had happened. And she realized that someone in that Serb militia outside the city had saved her life. He had spent a lot of time secretly bending that piece of metal backwards and forwards so it broke, so it wouldn't fire, so it wouldn't kill her. And then she had a dilemma, because by that time in the war, of course, she hated Serbs. And she thought, you know, after the war, you know, I will never have anything to do with these people. And of course, they dress the Serb population would dress slightly differently to the Muslim population in Sarajevo. They would use slightly different language, things like that. There'd be clues when you're walking down the street, whether this person was Serb or Bosnian Muslim or Croatian. They have different religions and subtle differences in culture. And she knew the war would be over sometime. And she knew she'd be walking down the street someday. And someday, there's only at that time 4.5 million people in the whole country. She knew she'd be walking down the street someday and she would walk past that man who had saved her life. And she couldn't bear the thought that she would look angrily at him and hate him. She couldn't bear that thought. And so she decided that the only thing that made sense for her to do was to feel love and gratitude to every Serb that she ever met. And in a sense, she came out of that war. I know we wouldn't choose the war, but she came out of that war a better human being than she was before. She understood what was really, really important, which is that feeling of love and gratitude. And maybe she wouldn't even have noticed that in that strong a way before. And that, for me, that's what I mean by resilience. So it's not just managing. It's actually finding new meanings and new ways of responding in life that you wouldn't have got without the crisis. So sometimes people ask me what's new in this field for me, and I just wanted to finish off by mentioning a couple of things that I think are really important that I've been learning over the last year. One of them is an emergency technique that has increasing research with to teach people to do at the time. You know, I've said there are things you can do afterwards, like the eye movement processes. There are things that at the time are important, like having friends to hug and so on. And one thing that almost combines both those things is a technique, a sort of cognitive and sensory technique called havening. So havening is a new technique. Look it up online. It's having some ongoing research done in Britain about its use, and it involves teaching the person to kind of stroke themselves in specific researched places, like not just touch their body generally, but to, for example, on the shoulders here and across the face here and on the palms of the hands. And so these are places that we have research showing that these places will actually trigger a different response in the amygdala. So, so while they do that, they distract their working memory, their short-term memory, by giving it some kind of cognitive thinking task to do while they calm down the amygdala. And the reason is otherwise they would start asking those why and what if questions and unhelpful things with their short-term memory. So, so it combines those two things. And if you haven't learned that yet, I think it's really worth learning, and something that you can show people to do for themselves immediately. And we've used that. My wife, Yulia Kurasheva, and I, we are training online in Ukraine, and we've shown hundreds of people how to do that, and we get them to measure how they feel subjectively from the start as they think about the war to the end of doing that process. And it's dramatic. It's really dramatic, and they are in the firing line. They're in the situation. The other thing that I've been really interested in the last year is what's called collective trauma recovery. So I'm really interested in the fact that when we look at it, something like a war, what we're seeing is not just the damage that's happening now, but the results of damage that goes back a long way. And so that includes things, for example, now that we see inside Russian culture, to use that example with the invasion of Ukraine, that plug into distress that's happened over hundreds of years, and certainly into the distress of the time of Joseph Stalin and horrible things that happened in the immediate ancestry of those people who are now being kind of energized into a war. And so we know that there are epigenetic changes that happen when whole people go through traumatic experiences. We know that from research on Jewish people who've been through the Holocaust compared to Jewish people whose ancestors haven't been through the Holocaust. There are differences, and they respond differently. They're more, when they have that epigenetic instruction to be on the alert for danger, then of course they're more paranoid, more aggressive. They don't sleep as well, stuff like that. So it seems to me really important when we're thinking about resilience, not just to think about individual human beings. You know, one of the things that's most dramatic about research with resilience is that it makes a difference which culture you come from. And because some cultures are more supportive and some cultures are more individualistic, and that doesn't work as well in a crisis. So the main North American culture, for example, is very individualistic. There's all sorts of cool things about that, but resilience is not one of them. And so, so if we look at crises, for example, on the islands of Hawaii, where you have a North American population, they collapse very quickly in the crisis, whereas the Japanese population there and the native Hawaiian population are much more resilient. And they do that because they have, in a sense, a more resilient culture. So I'm really interested in building cultural resilience, and that means helping people change their culture so that there are less sources of trauma. So that means dealing with racism, patriarchy, with individualism, these are kind of sources of damage. And I'm not the only one who's interested in doing this. There's one kind of therapy called IFS, internal family systems, that actually is, from the beginning, has been looking at this collective trauma recovery kind of process. And I think that's a kind of a leading edge for us. So thank you for your interest, for listening to what I've been saying here. I hope you're having a great conference. I look forward to, I did get to go back last year to Europe again. I look forward to meeting you sometime in Europe or wherever it is that you're watching this from. And stay safe, find really useful meanings, and remember, we're all part of a big story. And you connecting with me here, that is a resilient choice just in itself. To look at another human being who's smiling at you, who believes in you, who cares about you, from all the way over the other side of the world, your amygdala knows that that is an important event. Thanks, folks. See you again sometime.